At 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on August 19, 2026, a 50% tariff was set to slam into nearly $20 billion of Canadian goods entering the United States. And it was going to happen even for products that were supposed to be protected by a decades-old free trade agreement. That single detail, confirmed by trade attorneys at Holland & Knight and White & Case, is what makes this story different from every other tariff fight of the past year. This was not a negotiating tactic dressed up as policy. It was a president reaching for a law so old, so obscure, that the last confirmed use of it dates back to the 1940s, according to trade law analysts who reviewed the statute's history. And as the deadline closed in, the deal that was supposed to stop it kept slipping further out of reach. To understand how the United States and Canada ended up here, you have to go back to February of 2026. That is when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the sweeping tariffs Trump had imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, ruling, as a SCOTUS blog reported, that the Emergency Powers Law never gave the president authority to impose broad import duties unilaterally in the first place. It was a major defeat. IEEPA had been the administration's most flexible tool, the legal foundation for tariffs against dozens of countries at once. Overnight, that foundation was gone, and for a White House that had built an entire trade strategy around the threat of sweeping, fast-moving tariffs, the ruling created an urgent question. What law replaces it? The administration's answer, at least where Canada was concerned, was Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. The same year, the same broader piece of legislation as the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, a law economic historians have long blamed for deepening the Great Depression. Section 338 lets a president impose duties of up to 50% on goods from a country found to be discriminating against American commerce. And unlike Section 301, which requires a formal investigation by the U.S. Trade Representative, or Section 232, which requires a national security finding, Section 338 requires almost nothing. No investigation, no public hearing, just a presidential proclamation. That is precisely why the administration chose it. It was fast, and after February, fast was exactly what the White House needed. On July 20th, 2026, President Trump signed 3 separate proclamations invoking Section 338 against Canada. Each one targeted a specific dispute. One covered motor vehicles, citing a roughly 22% drop in Canadian imports of U.S. dark-made cars between April 2025 and March 2026, a decline the White House's own fact sheet put it close to $6 billion. One covered alcohol, pointing to provincial liquor boards in 8 Canadian provinces that had pulled American alcohol products off their shelves entirely. And one covered dairy, targeting Canada's supply management system and its tariff rate quotas, which the administration says structurally shut out U.S. dairy producers. Each proclamation stood on its own legal footing. Together, according to the U.S. Trade Representative's office, they covered close to $20 billion of Canadian goods. But scroll past the headline categories, and the reach of these tariffs gets much wider. Buried in the annexes of each proclamation is a list that goes far beyond cars, wine and cheese, wine, hockey sticks, cement, plywood, furniture, fishing rods, seeds, clothing, wigs, swimming pools, electronics and telecom equipment, building materials like lumber and doors, plastics and packaging, toys and sporting goods, cosmetics and fragrances, agricultural products, down to flowers and plants. According to trade analysts at Thomson Reuters who dug through the full annexes, if a company's compliance review stopped at motor vehicles, alcohol, and dairy, there was a strong chance it hadn't found its actual exposure yet. This wasn't 3 narrow trade disputes. It was a tariff wall stretched across more than a dozen distinct industries. And here is the detail that caught even seasoned trade lawyers off guard. None of the 3 proclamations carved out an exemption for goods that qualify under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the free trade deal known as USMCA, or, in Canada, CUSMA. Under most of the tariff actions the U.S. and Canada fought over in 2025 and early 2026, USMCA-compliant goods got some form of relief. Not here. A Canadian product that would normally cross the border duty-free because it meets USMCA's rules of origin still faces the full 50% if its classification shows up in one of the annexes. For companies that had spent years building supply chains around USMCA preference, this wasn't a routine adjustment. It was, as one trade compliance firm put it, a structural change to how business gets done across the world's longest undefended border. To really understand how unusual this moment is, it helps to see the fuller timeline of how the U.S. Canada trade relationship got here, because this did not happen overnight. Back on August 1st, 2025, a 35% tariff on a broad range of Canadian goods not otherwise covered by USMCA went into effect, after an earlier deadline for a comprehensive deal passed without agreement. That October, Trump announced he would be layering an additional 10% tariff on top of Canadian imports, though no firm effective date was attached to that particular announcement at the time. Then, on January 31st, 2026, Trump threatened to push tariffs on Canada all the way up to 50%, a threat that, at the time, seemed to many trade analysts like classic negotiating leverage rather than a concrete policy plan. 6 months later, it wasn't a threat anymore. It was 3 signed proclamations with a hard, effective date. Canada was not the only country caught in this broader reshuffling of American tariff policy after the Supreme Court's February ruling. Just days after IEEPA was struck down, the administration moved quickly to reconstruct a tariff structure using Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 as a stopgap, according to trade law tracking by Butzel Long, before later shifting a large share of that structure onto Section 301. In July 2026, the U.S. also finalized a separate investigation into 60 trading partners, including Canada, concluding they had failed to adequately prevent forced labor practices in their supply chains, resulting in a new 10 to 12, 5% tariff layer that took effect July 24, 2026, with CUSMA-compliant Canadian goods exempted from that particular measure. Brazil, meanwhile, was hit with its own 25% tariff under Section 301 beginning July 22nd, with carve-outs for beef, coffee, energy products, aircraft, and rare earth materials. Seen together, these moves paint a picture of an administration methodically testing which older, less challenged statutes can replace the sweeping emergency powers it lost in February. And Section 338 against Canada stands out as the most aggressive of those experiments, precisely because it is the one with the least legal precedent behind it. If you're finding this kind of detailed, sourced breakdown useful, this channel goes deep on stories like this one as they develop. Subscribing means you won't miss the next update on how this specific dispute plays out, whether that's a deal, a court filing, or something else entirely. The tariffs were scheduled to take effect 30 days after signing, 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on August 19, 2026. And customs specialists at GHY International flagged another wrinkle that mattered enormously to exporters trying to beat the clock. U.S. Customs and Border Protection calculates duty based on the date a shipment actually enters the United States for consumption, not the date it leaves Canada. That meant a truck that departed at Canadian warehouse on August 18th, but crossed the border or cleared customs after midnight on the 19th, would still get hit with the full 50%. Exporters weren't just racing to ship, they were racing to arrive. Freight companies, customs brokers, and manufacturers across Ontario and Quebec spent the weeks before the deadline recalculating transit times down to the hour. So why is this being called a wall and not just another round in an already exhausting trade war? Because of what came before it. Trump has cycled through an unusually wide range of legal justifications for tariffs on Canada over the past 2 years, citing national security, fentanyl trafficking, even wildfire smoke at different points, according to reporting from the Globe and Mail. Section 338 is different. It's untested. It has never faced a court challenge in the modern era, because it has essentially never been used this way before. Trade press has taken to calling it the administration's nuclear option, not because of its size, but because of how little legal resistance anyone expected it to face going in. That assumption is now being tested in real time. Legal scholars are split, and it's worth being honest about just how split they are, because this is not a settled question. Philip Zelikow, an emeritus history professor at the University of Virginia, who helped litigate the earlier IEEPA case, argues that Section 338 was effectively repealed by implication back in 1962, and again in 1974, when Congress passed the Trade Expansion Act, and Section 301 of the Trade Act. His reasoning, laid out in a guest analysis for the legal blog The Volach Conspiracy, is that those later laws cover the whole subject Section 338 used to address, and that Congress wouldn't have bothered writing detailed investigation and hearing requirements into those newer statutes if a president could simply bypass all of it by dusting off a law from 1930. Zelikow calls Section 338 long dead, in his words, since at least 1962. Not everyone agrees. Yale law professor Jed Rubenfeld has argued that Section 338 remains fully in force, and that Congress never explicitly repealed it, no matter how many newer trade laws were layered on top. That distinction, implicit repeal versus explicit repeal, sounds technical, but it's the entire ballgame. Georgetown trade law experts Peter Harrell and Jennifer Hillman, both of whom played a role in developing the legal arguments that ultimately sank the IEEPA tariffs at the Supreme Court, wrote that the courts will have to resolve this debate themselves. Nobody covering this story credibly claims to know which way it will go. What's notable is that some of the same legal minds who beat the administration once are already circling this next fight. There's a second legal wrinkle specific to Section 338 that trade lawyers keep coming back to. The statute directs the U.S. International Trade Commission to monitor foreign discrimination and bring findings to the President's attention with recommendations. What it does not clearly say is whether that commission process has to happen before a president can act. Historical use of the law, dating back to the 1930s and 1940s, involved investigations launched by the commission first. This time, the administration skipped straight to proclamation. A future court challenge, according to legal analysis published by the outlet Law Commentary, could test not just whether Canada's policies meet the statute's definition of discrimination, but whether the tariff level in the selected products reasonably match the claimed harm, and whether the administration was required to let the Trade Commission weigh in first at all. Then there's the practical legal question of USMCA itself. The federal law that implements the agreement in U.S. law states plainly that American statute controls when it conflicts with the treaty, and that the agreement does not limit authority granted under a separate federal law unless Congress explicitly says otherwise. It also blocks private companies from challenging federal action purely on the grounds that it violates USMCA. In plain terms, an importer trying to block these tariffs in court can't simply argue, "This breaks our trade agreement," and expect that to be enough. They would need to show Trump exceeded what Section 338 actually authorizes, or that some other source of U.S. law was violated. That's a narrower path than it might sound like from the outside, and it's part of why some legal observers think Section 338 may hold up better in court than the IEEPA tariffs did. Simon Lester, a trade law expert cited by CBC News, put it about as directly as any legal analyst has. If discrimination against U.S. commerce genuinely exists, the statute gives the president room to act under Section 338, and Trump may be standing on more solid ground here than he was with the tariffs the Supreme Court struck down in February. John Verno, a former deputy U.S. trade representative now practicing at the Washington law firm Covington and Burling, made a similar point, noting that Section 338 simply carries fewer procedural limitations than the other tools available. That doesn't mean the tariffs are guaranteed to survive a legal fight. It means the fight, if and when it comes, may be closer and harder to predict than the last one. While lawyers argued over 1930s statutory language, the political and economic clock in Washington kept moving. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette met with you. Hess Trade Representative Jameson Greer 3 separate times in Washington across a 3-week stretch in late July and early August, according to CBC News. Both sides agreed to hold daily meetings at multiple levels as the August 19th deadline approached. But sources close to the talks told CBC that as of the second week of August, Canada and the United States weren't at a point where a deal could realistically be reached, and that Canadian officials were, in their words, unsatisfied with the latest offer on the table from Washington. Prime Minister Mark Carney has walked a careful line throughout. At a summer meeting of Canada's provincial premiers in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, Carney repeated a pledge he's made many times over the past year. Canada will not accept a bad deal, whatever the short-term cost of walking away. It's a politically risky position. The lumber, dairy, and manufacturing sectors most exposed to these tariffs are concentrated in politically significant provinces, and businesses on the ground were already feeling the pressure well before the deadline hit. At a lumberyard in Rensselaer Falls, New York, just 15 miles south of the Canadian border, workers loading white pine boards told a local reporter that roughly a third of their supply comes from Canada, meaning a 50% tariff wouldn't just squeeze Canadian exporters, it would raise costs for American businesses buying from them too. That cross-border pain is a recurring theme that tends to get lost in the political framing of these tariffs as something that only punishes the other side. The Tax Foundation's ongoing tracker of 2026 tariff actions estimates that, taken together, this year's tariffs amount to an average tax increase of roughly $900 per American household, and notes they have not meaningfully changed the overall U.S. trade deficit, the goal they were originally justified by. CNN business reporter Matt Egan, summarizing analysis from trade economists, noted that if the Canada tariffs take effect as planned, Americans could feel it directly through higher prices at a moment when many households are already stretched by rising energy costs and other everyday expenses. Stephen Brown, chief North America economist at Capital Economics, told CNN Business that it's striking just how far the administration is willing to reach for new legal tools to keep tariff policy alive after February's setback, and warned that if Section 338 survives a court test, it could become a permanent fixture of future trade negotiations, not just a one-time maneuver against Canada. It's worth pausing on why Canada specifically became the test case for this particular law. Trade talks between the two countries had already been strained for well over a year by this point. An August 1st, 2026 deadline for a broader trade deal came and went without agreement, triggering a separate 35% tariff on Canadian exports not otherwise covered by USMCA. The Canada-United States-Mexico agreement itself entered its scheduled 6-year joint review process after a July 1st extension deadline passed without the two governments reaching new terms. Peter Harrell, the Georgetown trade scholar, offered a theory for why Section 338 specifically emerged now. Trump had reportedly been frustrated for some time at not having a more flexible tariff authority after IEEPA fell. And with negotiations with Canada stalled and the clock on other legal tools running out, Section 338 became, in Harrell's assessment, the swiftest available way to regain leverage in the relationship. The specific grievances behind each of the three proclamations deserve a closer look, because they didn't come from nowhere. On alcohol, the dispute traces back to retaliatory measures Canadian provinces imposed after earlier rounds of U.S. tariffs, British Columbia among them. Premier David Eby said publicly that British Columbia's decision to keep American alcohol off provincial shelves reflected the province's integrity, and that there was, in his words, not a chance in hell those products were going back on the shelves, regardless of what Washington did next. That's not a minor provincial policy detail. It's a direct public refusal from an elected official to reverse the very practice the Trump administration cited as grounds for the tariff in the first place, which tells you how far apart the two sides are on more than just numbers. There's also useful context in how this Canada dispute compares to the parallel fight over the Section 301 tariffs applied to those 60 forced labor-related trading partners. Lawsuits, including a proposed class action, were filed in the U.S. Court of International Trade the same day those Section 301 tariffs took effect, according to trade law analysis from Butzel Long. Plaintiffs in that case argue the tariffs exceed what Section 301 actually authorizes, since that statute has historically been used to address specific practices in specific industries rather than a sweeping action against 60 countries simultaneously. That litigation is worth watching in its own right, but it's a legally distinct fight from the Section 338 proclamations against Canada. As of the most recent reporting available, no confirmed lawsuit had been filed specifically challenging the Canada Section 338 tariffs, even though multiple legal scholars have said publicly that they expect one eventually. That distinction matters because it would be inaccurate to say this specific 50% tariff is already in court. It isn't yet. The legal fight over it, if it comes, is still ahead. On dairy, the dispute centers on Canada's decades-old system of supply management, which uses tariff rate quotas to protect domestic dairy producers by sharply limiting how much American dairy can enter the Canadian market at low tariff rates. The White House argues this system structurally locks out U.S. producers no matter what quota commitments Canada made under USMCA. Canadian officials, for their part, have historically treated supply management as close to untouchable in trade negotiations, a political third rail tied to the livelihoods of dairy farmers concentrated in Quebec and Ontario. On motor vehicles, the U.S. points to that steep drop in Canadian imports of American-made cars as evidence of a market closing rather than opening, even as broader auto trade between the two countries remains deeply intertwined through cross-border supply chains that have existed for decades. As the clock ticked down toward the August 19th deadline, the news coming out of Washington shifted almost daily. Bloomberg reported in mid-August that American and Canadian negotiators were inching closer to a deal that could avert the 50% tariffs on products like hockey sticks, wine, and cement. Language that captures just how granular and, frankly, strange the list of affected goods had become by this point in the dispute. Industry executives and trade specialists following the talks described genuine movement, even as officials on both sides publicly declined to characterize how close an agreement actually was. By August 17th, with 2 days left on the clock, CTV News described the situation as coming down to the wire, with both governments continuing daily contact but no confirmed resolution. Prime Minister Carney's political balancing act deserves a closer look too, because it explains a lot about why these talks have moved so slowly. Bloomberg's coverage of a mid-August meeting of Canada's provincial premiers in Charlottetown described Carney as walking what the outlet called a political tightrope, trying to project firmness toward Washington without triggering the kind of economic pain that would turn provincial leaders and Canadian businesses against his own negotiating strategy. Premiers from provinces with heavy exposure to the affected industries, particularly those tied to lumber, dairy, and manufacturing, have been vocal about wanting a resolution, even as they've largely backed Carney's public refusal to fold under deadline pressure. That tension between provincial economic anxiety and national negotiating strategy has defined the Canadian side of this dispute for months, and it shows no sign of resolving cleanly before the deadline arrives. If a story like this, where geopolitics, law, and trade collide in ways that actually affect prices and jobs on both sides of a border, is the kind of thing you want more of, hitting that like button genuinely helps this kind of research-driven coverage reach more people who are trying to understand what's actually happening instead of just the headlines. Some voices close to the Canadian trade file offered a starker read on where things stood. Reports circulating among Canadian trade officials suggested that if talks collapsed entirely, Canada could consider walking away from broader USMCA negotiations altogether rather than accept unfavorable terms under pressure of the deadline. A threat that, if carried out, would push this dispute well beyond a narrow fight over dairy quotas and liquor shelves into a genuine crisis for the entire North American trade architecture that has underpinned the U.S., Canadian, and Mexican economies for more than 3 decades. Whether that threat was a genuine red line or a negotiating position designed to strengthen Canada's hand in Washington is something only the coming weeks will make clear. It's worth noting what these proclamations specifically left out, because the exclusions tell their own story about how carefully this was targeted. Energy products were excluded. Potash, a key fertilizer ingredient. Canada exports in enormous volumes was excluded. Goods already covered by separate national security tariffs on steel and aluminum were excluded, as were certain fish products and critical minerals. Steel and aluminum derivative products actually saw their tariffs drop under a separate adjustment made around the same time, according to trade compliance trackers monitoring the full run of 2026 tariff actions. There was also a narrow shipping exemption. Goods loaded onto a vessel before July 24, 2026, and entered for consumption in the United States. Before July 28th were spared the additional duty entirely, giving companies with cargo already in transit a brief window to avoid getting caught by a policy that was signed after their shipment had already left port. None of these exclusions soften the roughly $20 billion core of the tariff action, but they do show an administration trying to avoid disrupting sectors, energy and critical minerals in particular, where the economic and strategic costs of disruption would have been harder to absorb. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement's own review process adds another layer to why the timing of all this matters so much. Under the terms of CUSMA, the 3 countries were required to conduct a joint 6-year review, and a July 1, 2026 extension deadline tied to that review passed without the U.S. and Canada reaching new terms, according to a timeline of key dates compiled by the law firm Blake's. That means the Section 338 tariffs landed in the middle of an already tense structural review of the entire trade agreement underpinning North American commerce, not as an isolated dispute sitting outside it. Trade lawyers watching the CUSMA review process closely have noted that how this Section 338 fight resolves could shape the tone and substance of that broader review for years to come. Whether the 3 countries approach the agreement's future as partners working through disagreements, or as adversaries testing how far unilateral action can go before the whole framework starts to fray. It's also worth being honest about what remains genuinely uncertain here, because a story like this can easily slide into treating predictions as facts. Nobody covering this dispute, not the trade lawyers, not the economists, not the officials involved, can say with certainty whether a last-minute deal gets struck before the deadline, whether the tariffs go into effect and then get negotiated down afterward, or whether they simply stay in place while a court challenge plays out in parallel over the following months or years. Historical precedent offers limited guidance precisely because Section 338 has essentially never been used this way before. That is not a gap in the reporting. It's the honest state of a story, still very much in motion as of the most recent coverage. What is confirmed and worth restating clearly is this: 3 presidential proclamations signed July 20th, 2026, invoking a 1930 statute that had gone effectively unused since the 1940s. A 50% tariff covering close to $20 billion in Canadian goods across more than a dozen industries. No exemption for products that qualify under USMCA, breaking with the pattern set by earlier tariff rounds. A deadline of 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on August 19th, 2026. Negotiations that, according to the most recent reporting available, remained unresolved, with Canadian officials expressing dissatisfaction with the American offer on the table. And a legal community split down the middle on whether the underlying law even survives serious scrutiny in federal court. The stakes here reach further than the specific dollar figures or the specific list of products in the annexes. If Section 338 survives a legal challenge, assuming one is ultimately filed and litigated, trade analysts at Capital Economics and elsewhere have suggested it could become a template the administration reaches for again against other trading partners, precisely because it skips the investigation and hearing requirements that slow down every other tariff tool available to a modern U.S. president. That would represent a meaningful shift in how American trade policy gets made going forward, regardless of what happens between Washington and Ottawa in the days immediately ahead. A law written in the year of the Great Depression, dusted off nearly a century later, could end up reshaping how the next decade of American trade disputes gets fought, not just with Canada, but with any country the White House decides has been playing unfairly. There's also a quieter, longer-running pattern worth naming here, because it helps explain why so many trade lawyers describe this specific moment as a turning point rather than just another headline. Section 338's total absence of procedural requirements, no mandatory investigation, no public comment period, no formal finding beyond the president's own proclamation, means that if it survives a court challenge, virtually any future trade dispute could theoretically be resolved the same way. Not through months of USTR fact-finding or WTO-style deliberation, but through a signature and a 30-day countdown clock. Analysts at the Peterson Institute for International Economics have warned that this kind of speed, while politically appealing to an administration that wants fast leverage, strips away exactly the kind of deliberative process that historically gave trading partners confidence that tariff actions were proportionate and evidence-based rather than purely political. Whether that trade-off between speed and scrutiny is something Congress or the courts ultimately rein back in is, again, a genuinely open question, and it's one that extends well past this single dispute with Canada. For businesses on both sides of the border, the uncertainty itself has become its own kind of cost. Companies that spent years building supply chains around USMCA's tariff-free guarantees are now being told that guarantee doesn't apply here. Freight companies are recalculating shipping schedules down to the hour to beat a midnight deadline. Lumberyards in upstate New York are bracing for higher costs on the very Canadian wood they depend on. Provincial premiers in Canada are digging in publicly rather than backing down. And in Washington, trade negotiators continue meeting daily, racing against a clock that, as of the most recent reporting, showed no clear sign of stopping. So where does that leave things as this story reaches you? A tariff wall, built on a law almost a century old, aimed squarely at America's largest trading partner and closest geographic neighbor. A legal foundation that respected scholars genuinely disagree about in ways that go well beyond typical partisan disagreement over trade policy. A negotiation in Washington that, by every account available, as of the most recent reporting, remained unresolved with real distance between the two sides. And a deadline that arrived regardless of whether a deal was ready. This is a story that will likely keep evolving well past the moment this script was written, and the honest answer is that nobody currently knows exactly how it resolves. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about where all of this comes from. The core facts on the Section 338 proclamations, their effective date, and their scope are drawn from official U.S. Trade Representative statements and legal analysis published by the law firms White and Case, Holland and Knight, and Butzel Long, along with detailed trade compliance guidance from GHY International and Thomson Reuters. Reporting on the state of negotiations comes from Bloomberg, CBC News, CTV News, and The Washington Post. And the legal debate over whether Section 338 remains valid law draws on analysis published at the Volokh Conspiracy by Georgetown scholars Peter Harrell and Jennifer Hillman, commentary from University of Virginia's Philip Zelikow, and reporting from the Globe and Mail and CBC News, citing trade law expert Simon Lester and former Deputy U. Hess Trade Representative John Verino. Economic context comes from the Tax Foundation's tariff tracker and commentary from Capital Economics' Stephen Brown, as reported by CNN Business. One thing that remains genuinely unverified and contested, whether Section 338 was implicitly repealed by later trade legislation, is an open legal question that even specialists in the field do not agree on. And no you. Hess Court had issued a ruling on the Canada tariffs, specifically as of the most recent reporting available. Any claim about how a future court challenge would turn out would be speculation, not fact. And this script has tried to avoid presenting it as anything more than that. There's something worth sitting with here beyond the legal technicalities and the trade figures. Two countries that share the longest undefended border on Earth, decades of integrated supply chains, and a trade relationship that touches everything from dairy farms in Quebec to lumber yards in upstate New York, found themselves at a genuine impasse over provisions in a law written before either government's current leadership was even born. Whatever happens after this deadline passes, the fact that it got this far, that a 96-year-old statute became the mechanism for a fight this consequential, says something about how strained the underlying relationship had become, and how few conventional tools either side felt they had left to resolve it through negotiation alone. What do you think happens next? Does Washington and Ottawa find a last-minute path to a deal? Does this end up getting fought out in federal court over the coming months? Or does Section 338 simply become the new normal for how tariffs get imposed going forward? Leave your honest read on it in the comments. Genuinely curious where people who've been following this closely think it lands. And if you want to be there for the follow-up the moment this deadline actually resolves one way or another, subscribing is the only way to guarantee you won't miss it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.